Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. I have the legend himself, one day to have an apotheosis, Dr. Bart Ehrman. Welcome back.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I am too. I'm always thrilled to learn from you, the way you write, the way you speak. A lot of people are drawn to this, and I learn a lot every time we talk. And you've had students that I learn from as well. One of them that's going to be at this upcoming conference, shamelessly plugging that everyone should show up for. Because if you have any interest in the Apostle Paul, this will be the place. I mean, you have legendary Paula Fredrickson. You have Robin Faith Walsh and legendary James Taylor. Like, the list goes on. They're all legendary. My point is, amazing academics. Tell us about this conference, Bart, before we tackle the Apostle Paul a little bit and whet their appetite.
Well, yeah. So, this is the second time we've done the new insights into the New Testament, we call it. Last year we did the Gospels, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect. And man, it exceeded every expectation. It was fantastic. We had a ton of people come to it, and we had 10 presenters, and we're going to do the same thing this year. We'll have 10 presenters. These are all internationally known scholars of Paul, who are also really good at presenting the results of scholarship at a layperson's level, so that they'll be avoiding jargon. They'll be digging in though with really interesting stuff, issues related to the Apostle Paul, and with Q&A after each one. And there'll be events where people coming to the conference can meet these others remotely and talk with them. And so it's going to be a fantastic time for anyone interested in early Christianity, the New Testament, the Christianity itself. This is going to be a major conference. And so we're really looking forward.
It's very interesting to see how much can be said about this one figure and the writings that he has. Tells you how important he is in early Christianity. So I hope people will sign up. The link is in the description. There are various levels at which you could sign up. If you want to go all the way, they have a package where you're getting like behind the curtain, front row seat, VIP. Make sure you check it out. If you sign up for the conference, it also helps us here at Myth Vision. So Bart, I want to get into what you're bringing to the table a little here. Can you tease us on what you're presenting on the Apostle Paul?
Over the years, I've had a lot of people tell me they think that Paul is, I think the term they usually use is an egoist. He's self-important. And I've always been kind of reluctant to see it that way. I've always thought, Paul's actually, I think he's very sincere. I don't think that he's like putting on a show. I don't think that he is, that he's out for the fame, or that he's out, look, I mean, the guy's ministry is leading him to be beat up all the time, and to be flogged, and to be beaten with rods, and to be, stoned once. I mean, he's like, oh my God. And so he's not doing this for the kicks. But I did about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, I came to realize something that I thought was significant about Paul that I have not seen even scholars talk about. I came to realize that Paul understands that his mission of spreading the gospel to the Gentiles was predicted in Scripture, and that this was to be the last act of history, and that Paul understood himself to be the climax of God's plan for salvation. Wow. And so I'm going to try and demonstrate that Paul, I'm not going to be concerned about a psychological analysis. I don't think we can psychoanalyze people living 2,000 years ago. It's hard enough to psychoanalyze somebody who lies on your couch for twice a week for 3 years. Who you could talk with. If all you've got a few letters, like you cannot psychoanalyze the guy. But I think you can determine what it is that he thought about his mission. And it turns out it's even bigger than I had ever imagined.
So this idea of him being a prophet, a last days prophet, his mission to the Gentiles. I've done an interview in the past with you where we were talking about who are the Gentiles with Paul. And I've mentioned various groups who have different interpretations. One of those groups tried to say the Gentiles are actually secretly lost Israelites. And of course, you could see how that idea runs into the vein of what Dr. Staples at least is mentioning, though he isn't saying the Gentiles are actually literally Israelites. These other people do. And you're like, what? I've never heard of this. This is really, really weird, because you won't see that in any academic publications. But the last days thing, there's something about apocalypticism. Lately, there's a lot of videos that have been going on with apologists who try to act as though apocalyptic thought that we're seeing in the New Testament with the Apostle Paul, with Jesus, is conditional. They'll run to this Jeremiah passage and say, if you do, then this will happen. So they don't want it to have failed. So Jesus says, some of you standing here will not taste death. Or Paul comes on, we who are alive and remain, including himself, they will act as though it didn't fail. It was all just based on conditions. So Paul's mission was to the nations. Clearly, he had to do that in order for the end to occur. That didn't happen, so it didn't fail. Do you understand where I'm coming from? What do you say to this kind of reasoning, this, I will call it apologetic, to get Paul or Jesus off the hook with a failed prediction?
Oh, well, I think, I understand why some people would want to do that, because otherwise Jesus was wrong in saying that the end was going to come before all of his disciples died. And Paul would be wrong when he indicated that he would be alive when Jesus returned. And so if you believe in the literal interpretation of the New Testament, and you believe that Jesus and Paul could not be wrong about anything, because Jesus is the Son of God, and Paul has been inspired by God to say what he says. And so if that's what you believe, then by definition, they can't be wrong. And if they can't be wrong, and they say something that seems to be wrong, then it must only seem to be wrong. And so you have to find out some way for it seeming to be wrong, but not really to be wrong. So that's in general outline, that's a very familiar way of thinking among evangelicals and fundamentalists. Many of us are familiar with that way of thinking because it's the way we used to think, that we would just say, we'd come up with ways to explain it. And so the idea that the end is conditional is actually a biblical idea, because the book of 2 Peter advances this very notion. 2 Peter is often thought by scholars to be the last book of the New Testament to be written. Might be right, might be wrong, but they're usually dated to about the year 120 or so. So, like 60 years after Peter himself had died. But the book of 2 Peter is trying to defend against this issue that the end hasn't come yet. And 2 Peter is trying to explain why it hasn't come yet. And it has several explanations for it, but one of them is this kind of hypothetical thing that it was to come if. And so what 2 Peter says is that God wanted to provide more time for people to repent. So not enough people had repented, so God's given them more time. And so that's why it hasn't happened yet, so that people will have more time. And so it's all still going according to plan. 2 Peter is also the book, by the way, this is the other line a lot of people use. 2 Peter is the book, quoting the Hebrew Bible, that's referring to the Hebrew Bible, that the end is coming soon. But with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. And so when God says it's coming soon, he means according to his calendar, not according to our calendar. Today, when people say that to me, then I say, well, no, that's right. When your televangelist says, that Jesus is actually coming in 3 days, then you could start looking for him in the year 5024. And so it's that 3,000 years. Okay, good. Well, that's soon.
Just to I'm being funny a little here, but I would just want to be direct. So the Apostle Paul in his letters means exactly what 2 Peter is trying to teach, right?
No. Paul kind of the opposite. Paul says that when Christ comes back, the people who have already died, the followers of Jesus who have died already, will be raised from the dead, and they'll be the first to meet him in the air. And then we, who are alive, who remain, will then be taken up. And so he understands that he will be one of the ones who is still alive when Jesus returns. It's notable that this is the view that he advances in some of his earlier letters. In his later letters, like 2 Corinthians and Philippians, he seems to realize that he might die first before it happens, and there'll be some kind of short interim period. This will, by the way, during our conference, we're going to be having a roundtable discussion on an issue about whether Paul's views ever changed over time. I don't know if this one will come up, but for me, this is one of the issues that Paul appears to have changed his mind on. It's not that he thought it would be 2,000 years later. It's that he thought he might miss it by a couple months, and during that time, he would still be in Christ's presence.
You're literally saying exactly what Dale C. Allison Jr. was saying when I talked to him last about this topic with Jesus, because he had the idea that maybe Jesus, expected to die. If you kind of take at face value that Jesus really expected to die, knew he was going to death, that kind of thing, martyrdom concept, that it wasn't going to be long. It might have been immediate. It might have been a few months, but he was not expecting decades for the Son of Man to come and for these things to actually occur. So this is how Dale C. Allison Jr. kind of was hinting at it with what you're suggesting maybe later Paul thought. You brought up this interesting radical thing that I think you're going to cover. You're saying that other scholars haven't really dealt with, and that is how the scripture spoke in the past about Paul and his mission and what he's supposed to do. Can you give us a few examples, or even one or two, that tease about what you're suggesting Paul sees in his own mission as a prophecy or as foretold in the Hebrew Bible, Septuagint?
The main passages are in the book of Second Isaiah, which is the part of Isaiah. Isaiah is a very long book. It's a 66 chapter book, but between chapters 40 and 55 is a section that scholars call Second Isaiah, and it's a part of the book that was written during the Babylonian captivity. The nation of Israel has been the nation of Judah has been destroyed by the Babylonians, and the leaders of the people, the elite, have been taken back into captivity in Babylon. And this prophet, imitating the other Isaiah from 150 years earlier, this person is saying that God now has punished them. They'll be returning soon. And that God, in fact, is going to bless the nation, and he's going to elevate it, and all the Gentiles are going to come to Zion and worship the God of Israel, and that Israel will be a light to the nations and a light to the Gentiles, and so on. And so you have these passages about it's an individual, the servant, or who is the light to the Gentiles, who brings the salvation that came to the Jews to all people. And so these are the passages that Paul alludes to that about himself, that he's the light to the nations.
It's fantastic because Paula Frederickson book, she coined the term kind of ex-pagan. She goes into this and shows how Paul seems to be showing that there's like this optimistic eschatology for the nations and then a pessimistic one, right? Where they're destroyed. And then you get Jason Staples, who tries to fit the idea of Israel somehow in Paul's mind. Now, I look forward to hearing what Jason says, and I'm looking forward to interviewing him about his latest book on Paul. But as someone who taught him, and I don't know how much of his position you've like sat down and digested. I know you were on the dissertation committee, correct?
No, I directed the dissertation.
Oh,
yeah. So I do know his position rather well.
Well, I just want to ask you, because we all have opinions, and scholars, if they didn't disagree on something, there would be something wrong. The going hypothesis that I've always thought of in Romans was Paul's talking about Jews, the ones that have not accepted his Christ mission, accepted Christ for salvation. From like Romans 9, he wishes he were cut off for his kinsmen. I take these as Jews. He quotes kind of cherry picking, recontextualizing scripture to include these Gentiles. He's using it to kind of include Gentiles in the mission, but hey, you can be cut off too, just like they were. And then all Israel in the end will be saved once the fullness of the nations come in. I'm imagining it's that same group he wished he was cut off for before, that they would be like eventually the hardened hearts of these Jews that are not accepting his message are coming back. And I didn't know if you thought that was still the best explanation in your view, or if you had a different one, or if you thought Staples' understanding that in a sense, gathering in the nations, literally the non-Israelites, because they've been completely assimilated, it still keeps the fulfillment of Israel kind of theologically fulfilled by saving the nations. You're kind of doing two birds, one stone. What's your opinion on it, if you have one?
So he has a pretty precise understanding of what he's talking about. The way he started his dissertation work was by asking what that verse means that you just quoted. All Israel will be saved. So it's 5 words in English. All Israel will be saved. And he ended up writing about an 800-page dissertation on that question. What does the word Israel mean? And so he's asking a very specific question. When Paul says all Israel will be saved, what does he mean by the word Israel? The reason this was an 800-page dissertation that ended up being 2 books. When he wrote this thing, I was like, oh God, Jason, please, this is too long. But look, if you're going to try and publish this thing, you're not going to publish this as a book. You need to split it in half. and published 2 books, which he did with Cambridge University Press. So these are good books, but they're academic books. But the first one deals with just this issue. If an ancient Jew says the term Israel, what do they mean? And, we kind of naturally think we know what they mean. And what he did is something nobody else had ever done before. He went through every piece of ancient Israelite and Jewish literature and looked at every reference to the term Israel to see what it meant to people. And what he argues is it does not mean the Jews. So what we call the Jews are people who are descended from Judea. So people call themselves Jews, are descended from Judea, which was one of the 12 tribes. Jason argues that when Paul or anyone else says the term Israel, they don't mean just the tribe of Judea. They mean the 12 tribes. And so if Paul says all Israel will be saved, what does he mean? He doesn't mean that all Jews will be saved. This is his argument. It doesn't mean what you and I also kind of thought pretty much. It just means that, everybody who's Jewish would end up being saved in the end. He argues that what it really means is that that God will save everyone descended from the Israelites. And the problem is that the 10 tribes were intermarried with non-Jews after the Assyrian invasion in the 8th century BCE. And so to get all of Israel, you've got to get everybody in that bloodline, which means you've got to save all the Gentiles, because that's where a lot of the bloodline is now. And so that's his argument. Yeah. So
yeah, I didn't know what your thoughts were about
it. Well, I think it's a very sophisticated argument, and I think it's hard to refute. But there's something in me that doesn't quite buy it. But it's not because of it's an erudite and brilliant piece, and so it may be just I'm reluctant because I don't really think that Paul's. I don't know. See, part of it is that this is what Jason's trying to do is he's trying to explain the Gentile mission, right? He's trying to explain why is Paul converting all these Gentiles, and he's concerned that all Israel will be saved. I think within the context of Romans 9-11, Paul is really trying to deal with is whether God now has abandoned the Jews or not. I think that's the major question. If God is taking the message to the Gentiles, has he abandoned the Jews? If Gentiles don't have to keep the law of Moses and they are now God's chosen ones, does that mean God has abandoned his promises to Israel to be his chosen one? And Staples' argument is that no, that in fact he's going to save all of Israel. But I personally don't think he's thinking about all of Israel here. I think he is talking about the Jewish people. Apart from that term Israel and the technical way it gets used everywhere, I don't see much evidence in Paul that he's out to save the Gentiles because he wants to get all the bloodlines in.
Right. It could be, I guess you and me could agree and say there's an underlying factor in his mind, because again, he thinks he's the final one to try and put the icing on the cake for the end to take place. You could say one of the motivating factors on getting the Gentiles is to cause Israel to jealousy, or the Jews to become jealous. That could be part of it, but I don't think that's the only motivating factor. And I think that I agree with you. I love to just swallow this idea and think this is the case. I'm struggling like you are, in a sense, because you have now Jews scattered all over the same way kind of ancient Israel was. There's diaspora. It's hard for me to think he's not recontextualizing in a first century setting and not meaning exactly what it meant in the 8th or 6th century BCE under Babylon or Assyria.
Yep. But Staples doesn't stick to that stuff, of course. He looks at every Jewish text. He goes through the Dead Sea Scrolls and the rabbinic text and stuff after the New Testament. So he really does do a thorough job. But I think your point's a good one too, is that when the actual arguments Paul uses, for example, of making the Jews jealous, the whole point of converting Gentiles is because Jews will realize that others are now coming into the people of God and they'll want to come back then. It creates a sense of jealousy. And that doesn't seem to tie in quite as well in my opinion, with the idea that the Gentiles somehow are carrying along the Jewish bloodlines.
Wow. Final question, and it's related to the conference. I hope everybody signs up. Bart, why should everyone invest in coming to this conference, in your opinion? Because I can give mine, and I'm just going to say this out front. Paul is so important in understanding early Christianity, and the scholars, I'm telling you, I've been reading them. I know almost all the scholars' works that are coming to this conference. Every one of them are vital. What is your opinion? Maybe you hit it differently than I do.
These are some of the best scholars of Paul in the world. Some of them are of a generation younger than me. Some are my generation. there aren't too many living generations older than me. So we're covering a wide gamut here. And the topics they're picking are just exceedingly interesting. I mean, Jason Staples is not talking about this particular topic. He's talking about one that's even more controversial, he and I have had a lot of discussions about this one. He thinks the idea that has been around as long as Protestantism has been around, that a person is justified only by faith and not by their works, that Paul is opposed to the idea that you have to do good deeds in order to be saved. He thinks that's completely wrong. He thinks, in fact, you're justified by deeds, according to Paul. I said, whoa, okay, that's it. And this guy's a good arguer, by the way, and he knows his stuff. So that's just like one, and you have things like Paul Frederickson coming in and talking about things like, was Paul and were other Jews at the time actually monotheists? We think so, but no, actually, really? What does that even mean? And she's going to be blowing that one apart. I have another former student who's going to be at this named Ben White, who is another really, really bright guy. I don't know if you've talked with him yet, but he's really bright. And he's undercutting a lot of what scholars have done with Paul. We all of us talk about how there are 7 undisputed letters of Paul. And the 6, maybe not really by Paul or probably not by Paul, but these 7, these are the undisputed letters. And Ben White is asking, why are they undisputed? Are you sure they're undisputed? Should they be undisputed? What kind of criteria are we using here? And if you apply these criteria to some of the letters you think Paul didn't write, how does it all work? And so he's calling that into question. You have Jennifer Canoose coming along and talking, and oh man, this is a hot topic: sexual terms in Paul. When Paul says that homosexuals will not enter into the kingdom, or that the effeminate will not enter into the kingdom, she's going to go into this very deep thing that you would be familiar with about these Greek terms and what they actually mean and don't mean, and what does the term, when Paul talks about unnatural sexual acts, people typically think, oh yeah, he's talking about those people who are, in same-sex relations. Oh my God, what's wrong with these people? It's unnatural. Actually, Paul means a lot more than that. He probably means a lot of things that people are doing in their bedrooms. And it's like, and so those are unnatural too. So I don't know exactly what any of these people is going to say, because I haven't read their talks. I do know their topics, and I know them, and I'm thinking this is going to be incredible, because this is the kind of stuff that scholars talk about among themselves, but to get this to a general audience in a way that people can understand is going to be phenomenal.
I think so. And I'm looking forward to being there. Everybody, again, the link is in the description. Go get your seat reserved. You can sign up for 3 different tiers. The top VIP gets you all sorts of cool stuff. Is there anything that I didn't mention that the highest level gets them?
There are going to be several additional events. We did this thing last year. As you know, we had like 3,000 people show up, and it was fantastic. And it was so good. We weren't sure going in, is this going to work? How's it going to be? And oh my God, it's so far beyond what we had hoped for. And now we're deciding, okay, we're going to expand it, and we're going to have a VIP mixer where people can come and have breakout groups and talk about topics with some of the experts, and we're going to have a roundtable discussion among some of the scholars about a controversial topic about whether Paul changed his views, and we're going to have 2 people kind of dealing with a really hot topic on Paul's sexual ethics, and so we're going to do these additional events. Last year we had an additional event where I talked about my perspective on these other papers that were given. I'm going to do that again this year, but on top of that, we have these other things with all these other brilliant scholars, and so this is one people really don't want to miss, I think.
Thank you so much, Bart Ehrman. Thank you, everybody.